Hey, we're back, and I think I figured out how to make it clear. So that's nice, now that we're nearly done. But for tomorrow, I guess. So I will go over this now. So the Immigration Act of 1924 most directly reflected. Now, before we even think about this, we're looking at this idea of illegal aliens, the making of modern America. Now, we know that this was written in 2004, so this is a historical document, a secondary source, not a primary. But we're thinking about the system of quotas. We're thinking of exclusion and ineligibility of things, especially from East and South Asia, right? So we're like, this is all feeling a lot like some of those laws that came about when we were really afraid of other people and other people that weren't Americans, and we just wanted to be ourselves and stay in our own little bubble. And when did that happen? 1924, which was after what? First World War. So we know that conflicts arising from the migration doesn't really have anything to do with the Immigration Act, so that's not it. Cultural tensions between scientific modernism and religious fundamentalism. What does that have to do with anything? No, get it out. And then national culture from the 1920s. You may be encouraged to do that because you're like, oh, national culture. We wanted to stay with ourselves, right? But this is talking about like the Roaring Twenties, right? The Jazz Age, Harlem Renaissance, this emergence of art, cinema, mass media. Sure, that was happening, but that was what was influencing national culture, not this idea of we hate people who aren't us, so therefore let's stay isolationist and have our own little thing. Best answer is D. And then this one's tricky, right? Which of the following would support the argument? The best thing would be census data, because then you'd be able to see how those percentages went from before this act of 1924 to after, right? So you can actually see the drastic change in the populations to be able to prove how this indeed impacted foreign immigration. Now you may say that this might be it, right? C, diplomatic correspondence reflecting the increasing isolationism and the United States foreign policies. That was a motivation. That was like the political and sort of like the philosophy behind this, right? But if we're looking for evidence to support this argument that the that like the system of quotas, or we're trying to look at like the actual numbers of people, then we need to look at data A. Okay. So, Harry Truman, known as the Truman Doctrine, right? So before we even get into this, we're thinking Unit 8. This was in our packet of reading, right? So Unit 8, Truman, 1947, World War II is over, Truman's president. What are we fearful of after World War II? We are afraid of communism. So, Truman Doctrine is probably going to relate to that. And if you remember what the Truman Doctrine is, beautiful. That's going to make everything so much easier. But if you did forget it, then you can still use some of those context clues. So, in this statement, Truman had the goal of, let's just pretend that we all remember what the Truman Doctrine is to make our lives easier. Doesn't want to avoid a military confrontation with the Soviet Union just yet. That's not relevant. We see that we don't need to create alliances with recently decolonized nations. You could argue that because it's like, oh, well, we did want to make sure we were friends with like the smaller people, so this way they didn't get thrown into communism. But really, this was the main goal, right? At the heart of it, we were most concerned with restraining communism in both the military power of the communists as well as their ideological influence on places. So we know it's A. So Truman issued the doctrine primarily in order to exactly this, right? We can use that idea based off of just our own knowledge of this time period. Bolster non-communist nations. We want to make sure that we are protecting and supporting people who are like us, who are democracies, who are anti-communist, especially in Europe that was just still ravished from the World War II. So we want to make sure we're supporting our people that think like us and avoid communism. Communism is bad in this scenario. Great. Okay. 19 through 21. So we have this picture, right? I think we've seen this one before. So conditions shown like the ones in the image most directly contributed to which of the following? So You might think, well, this looks like tenement housing. This looks like what happened in the cities. This looked like overcrowding. This looked like tenement housing. This looked like all the bad things that came from the Gilded Age, right? That's when we had the immigration flipped classroom, and that we had that corresponding with the same time that we were looking at the Gilded Age. So that might be some of the first things we're thinking about with this photo, especially since there's no actual date other than the fact that this is a late 19th century, which we also know, late 19th century, so like 1880s, 1890s. What is that? The Gilded Age. Great, we're on the right track. So, which of the conditions directly contribute to the following? Not even looking at this anymore. We know if this is talking about the Gilded Age, what did the Gilded Age directly contribute to the formation of the Progressive Era, so that the Progressive Era could fix some of the problems of the Gilded Age. Boom. B. 20. Conditions depict which of the following trends? It looks bad in there. You could say the rise of settlement housing and populist movements. Maybe, right? Because you could make a bunch of jumps being like, oh, well, settlement housing helped people who were poor, and the populist movement came later, right? But we're talking about like in this moment, right? Those were all reactions to the Gilded Age after. Clearly it's not this, clearly it's not this, right? So the best is A, because this is people living in poverty. So the gap at this time, this is showing exactly how people were living in poverty. A. And then 21. Advocates for individuals such as the one shown in the image would have most likely agreed with which of the following perspectives. So, the Supreme Court's decision that Plessy versus Ergen was justified, maybe, but like that's, who knows, right? That's not anything concrete. Capitalism would improve social conditions, probably not. Like that would not really be what people who would be advocating for these folks, like what they would be focusing on at this point. Do you think that advocates that were concerned about the plight of the poor would be saying that wealth and poverty were the products of natural selection? Oof, yikes, no. However, government should act to eliminate the worst abuses of industrial society. Yes, we know that the Progressive Era and people like Jane Addams, people who created the Settlement House, people who came up with ideas of how to best support the poor, came from all these problems of the Gilded Age and therefore the Progressive Era, where we had a lot more government regulation and a lot more federal and social reforms to address these things. So, best answer is D. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because this is an example of a question that like we never really focused on. We never really talked that much about national parks and the environment too much in class. So this is going to be one of those ones that you may see this and you're like, what? How do I do this? So let's talk this through. First off, John Muir. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of or been to Muir Woods. It is right outside. I just went actually in November when I was out in San Francisco for my boyfriend's mom's 70th, oh, whoa, not 70th, 60th, 60th birthday. And Muir Woods is a woods. It's a forest that has some redwood trees and really beautiful, and it's a park. He was a big nature guy. So if we ever see his name in general, think about nature. Think about Muir Woods. Think about the environment. So he's writing here. We see Yosemite National Park. We're seeing things like groves, gardens, meadows. Beautiful, picturesque. He's talking about his visits. It's one of God's great gifts, right? And we're seeing 1909. So, let's see. Which of the following aspects of Muir's description expresses a major change in Americans' view of the natural environment? So, to do this, we need to be thinking, okay, well, in 1909, what do we think Americans thought about the environment prior to this, right? We can think about how we know about Manifest Destiny, that we wanted to move west. We can think about how we cared about farming and we cared about this agrarian lifestyle for a while, but then we were moving more into industry. So we were like, creating these man-made things we were creating railroads, we were, creating all this stuff to help us become more industrialized. So maybe we have like a little bit of disrespect for nature, you could argue, because we're trying just to move away from agrarianism. But let's just use some of that in the back of our minds. So let's see. A, the idea that the wilderness areas are worthy subjects for artistic works. Maybe, but I think that, like, if you think back to that Manifest Destiny painting, right? That was a really beautiful artistic painting of nature. So it seems like we've always thought nature was beautiful. Why would that change now? So that's probably not it. The idea that wilderness areas serve as evidence of divine creation. If anything, we were like more religious prior to 1909. So I wouldn't consider that to be a change. We would be all of a sudden getting more religious and trying to like prove God's existence through this, right? That doesn't feel right. The idea that government should preserve wilderness areas in a natural state, that seems like that might be a change, right? Since I just talked about how like we had been so committed to industry before this doesn't seem, that seems to be a change, right? If we're then asking government to not step in and to actually protect things, right? And this is also saying one of God's best gifts ought to be faithfully regarded, faithfully protected. That maybe feels like a good option. Or the idea that mountainous scenery is more picturesque and beautiful than flat terrain. What? That doesn't mean anything. So C feels like the best answer, and indeed it is. Now this last part. Muir's ideas are most directly a reaction to, now, if we can get this, right, we can see, well, what's the change then? Why should we preserve? Clearly then it means that we weren't preserving, that maybe we were being inappropriate with the land and exploiting it too much. And that makes sense, right? There's a direct connection between those two questions, so you can use that to get to A. You can also say, some of these might seem like good answers, but don't get thrown off, like increase in the urban population. They weren't trying to get more people to move to the woods, right? Like this isn't asking people to move west. That might be a good answer if they were talking about Manifest Destiny, but they're really asking, like, why did this come about? And that's because we were misusing the lands. We were using it too much. We were exploiting it for our own purposes. And now we need to have these different national parks and these different areas that we're actually just protecting the land. So I'm going to post this all. Tomorrow we will have questions 24 through 55. Good luck. Happy studying.